Amazing. Thank you so much and welcome. Good morning, afternoon, or good evening, wherever you may be. I noticed that there's a bunch of people from all over the world. So, welcome, welcome, of course. Now, what I will do, I'm just going to share my screen and get myself set up. I'm hoping that the group can see this now. So very good. So today, I'm going to talk to you a bit about, scaling a business with design thinking. Just for a bit of intro, my name is Bevinash Mohabeer, and I've been thinking like a designer for almost 15 years now. When I used to think about design, I used to think about it like this. And then actually, after my career has grown over time, I've started to think a little bit more of design like this, okay? Like many other designers that I know, I love coffee, right? But not like a lot of designers that I know. I'm actually a qualified mathematician. And I've used that as a platform to basically help me think more strategically like a designer. And one extra thing that I will say is that I love to tell stories. So a lot of the time today, I am going to be spending some time telling you a bit of a story, a bit about how design thinking works, a bit about how we've applied it in the past, and also just give you a bit of context into how you can use it to better scale your business. So starting off with a story, I'll take you and set the scene into New York City. While I was working there with a very prestigious client, we were initially working, in-house, just kind of getting some things together, some materials together. And we initially had our briefing conversation, and towards the end of the conversation, the client hit us with a statement, and the statement goes like this: we need to innovate with design thinking. Ooh, now, design thinking, great buzzword to throw into a scoping session, absolutely love it. And it got us thinking, and we actually ended up having a bit more of a conversation. So what I actually want to understand from the group perspective, what I want to start off with on this webinar is, what is design thinking? We hear it so many times. We hear it from a stakeholder or another designer in our team, or we may have learned it from other places. But just to get a consensus from the group, if you access the chat in this window, if you've ever heard the term design thinking, or this is the first time you've heard it, just pop in the chat. What is design? When you hear the word design thinking, what are you thinking about? What comes to mind when you hear design thinking? Some people may have heard this before, in terms of, just it being a way designers think. Some people see it as, this really interesting framework. So does anybody have any idea of what they think design thinking is? Like, what is the perception? Okay, I've got Honor here, who's talking about organized thinking. Prakash, it's an innovative way of producing things. Very good. An approach to make things user-friendly from Kiran. Thank you very much. And design, the way we think by the way we iterate. Good word there. I love that word. Creative thinking, good stuff, really good stuff. Human approach, absolutely love that. So what is design thinking? Let's really get into it right now. Where did this all really start from? Now, in the 40s and 50s, these two gentlemen spoke about design thinking for the very first time. And they mainly talked about it from a psychological and an engineering perspective. So how do you utilize creative engineering from John E. Arnold, but that was adapted from the psychological aspect from Max Herthweimer. In a more modern context, and in one thing that we relate to a lot more, is Tim Brown's definition from Ideo. Now, Ideo is a consulting firm that specializes in design thinking, and it's coined as a method and an iterative process to understand users, challenge assumptions, redefine different problems, and create solutions so that we can learn and test from them as we go through it. And it's this whole method. So sometimes what the real aspect of design thinking really talks about is this concept of divergent and convergent thinking. And many people talk about this many times, about going wide and then being able to narrow down on a specific point. Some people even use this in context as a double diamond, so that they're constantly doing this through your delivery process. Some of you may have seen this diagram before, where whenever they say, what is design thinking? And you've seen a diagram of something along those lines or connects the dots between these 5 key points. Some people talk about design thinking as this method, which is the design squiggle. So it's the idea of saying like, it's all really crazy at the beginning, but then it essentially kind of narrows down throughout the process. But we can throw the diagrams on the board, we can throw it in coffee shops, we can talk about it to our managers, but what is it? What is design thinking? That still doesn't answer the question. The diagrams still don't answer those questions. So in a nutshell, the way that we like to propose it, or the way that I like to frame the concept of design thinking, is that design thinking is a process that is used as a systematic approach to problem solving. So it's how we anticipate problems within our business and be able to solve for them using a specific framework. Now, let's take a look at the problem solving timeline, just very simply, right? We're starting from one end, and we want to be able to get to the solution towards the end, or a version of a solution. So how do we do that? What do we do when we're doing design thinking, trying to solve problems? What are we doing? First of all, we're trying to frame existing problems. So what we're trying to do is to say what exists in our business today and be able to frame them as an objective to solve for. We then take a look at how we've framed that, and then we try to understand where this problem is coming from. Is it coming from a user pain point? Is it coming from an engineering perspective? Is it coming from a development within the markets, and we want to try and capitalize on that through a new solution? So we're trying to gather insight and be able to feed the solutions that we create. Once we've got a consensus of that, we then go into this process of just creating and ideating. So I don't want to use the word creating too often, but essentially like we're trying to come up with new ideas and trying to empower the idea of saying like, look, there's more than one way to do a specific solution. So coming up with different processes, different methods that are not only business centered, that satisfy the business, but also things that actually humans can connect with. Now, once we've got something that we're kind of familiar with and that we're all kind of got a consensus as a group, we then go to the market. We then go ahead and experiment, and we test this. And it's not necessarily in huge groups or in large quantities. This could simply be walking around your local office or your co-working space and just experimenting with the idea that you have in mind. The purpose of this is to validate the framing that you've done at stage number one, and making sure that you have empathized accurately, so that you can essentially release this and define the success of the new solution that you have created. So when we're talking about a systematic approach to problem solving, what we're doing is that we're trying to frame and empathize with the idea of what we're trying to solve for, go in many different directions of how we solve for this, and experiment with it with our customer groups or our consensus, and then be able to release that strategically. So where do teams use design thinking? This whole idea of being able to systematically solve problems. So like I said, it's there to systematically solve problems within your business, right? And it's not about asking your design team how you should run your business, right? So we're talking about some people who have mentioned creative thinking and taking a human approach. It's not saying, designers, please tell me how I should run my business, or product, please tell me how I should run my business. It's about being able to understand the problems of all these areas and be able to solve for them strategically by learning from each other as a business. Now, when I talk about design thinking, it's not necessarily used on a large scale. It doesn't have to be. So the largest disruptors that we know today have utilized design thinking since their inception. If we look at the status of Netflix and Airbnb, Uber, and Facebook, these companies have utilized design thinking from the very beginning, and they are who they are as a result of it. So design thinking, how does it apply and where does it go? Now, when we're talking about businesses or businesses that run specific products or services, the most common route, the way design thinking is ultimately applied, is in the design delivery phase, right? So we're talking about this as like a company who has a product or service that exists today, and they're trying to apply a bit more of a design thinking, problem solving approach to their product or service. So we can influence it in the delivery cycle by being able to empathize with our end users and tackle the actual product challenges. And we do that through actually analyzing the existing state and also the future of what our product looks like. So we can run ideation sessions on how we want to grow the product in a new era. We can also test some of those ideas with users through the delivery phase, so that if we bring things into the next increment or the next sprint, we have a reason to why we're doing what we're doing. Similarly, what it can also do through the delivery phase is actually enable the strategic discovery piece. Now, this takes place when a company has a product or service that exists and wants to explore a new space. This can also happen, not necessarily as a carryover, but it can also happen at the very beginning. So when a company is, very greenfield, trying to, satisfy a wide range of people and trying to pick their points in the market, they can use design thinking through their discovery phase. So this helps them better build out their roadmaps and defining their MVP and go-to-market strategy. So design thinking is used here in the discovery aspect and the MVP cycle to better align on your goals for the user and for the products that you're solving for, empathize with your end customers or your target customers, benchmark against what exists already, or at least what you've hypothesized, and being able to satisfy pain points with the different kinds of creative directions that you choose to take when you're trying to find out the solutions that go into the greenfield market. Now, these ultimately do go hand in hand. So sometimes, as I said, applying design thinking in delivery naturally carries you forward into new discovery, because you've solved problems, you've identified new problems, and you want to try and discover them a bit more and learn a bit more about them and how you can work with them. Similarly, you can also start from the very beginning and start with a set of features and essentially build them out through discovery, and then use them to influence your delivery cycle. But that's all with respect to businesses and products and services that somewhat currently exist or in the start of reaching the market. Where design thinking ultimately works in these big industries that I just mentioned earlier is that they use it to influence their teams. And it's not just design teams. So how do you use design thinking to better create an environment to enable your delivery cycle and strategic discovery cycles? So I'm going to hit you with a scenario. I mentioned earlier that I love to tell stories, and for the rest of this time, I'm actually going to tell you a bit of a story. So what happens when design thinking essentially scales within an enterprise that's primarily led by engineering, right? So the enterprise that I'm going to talk to you guys about specifically worked within the domain of trucks. Okay. Now, as a full disclaimer, this was a technology company, but they were not building transformers. That was at least the first expectation, first question I asked. But the second question I asked is like, where are you applying your product with trucks? And it was actually on the supply chain and the logistics aspect, right? So what they were doing with trucks is essentially trying to understand, they had a product which basically helped the supply chain of truck movements between different ports. So I'll give you an example. Let's say we have coffee beans, right? If coffee beans need to go from a factory to the other side of the world, this product would essentially enable that business to be able to send coffee beans to their local port, load it onto a ship, send that to the other side of the world, allow that to come off the ship and clear customs, and then be able to be taken to their local supermarket, or in this case, the barista that actually buys the beans itself. So they were essentially producing a port community system that enabled this entire process in a very legacy industry known as the logistics and supply chain. So when we walked in, we started off on the delivery aspect because this product had already been building for 2 years straight. So they were in full delivery mode. They were running on Scrum, and they were basically just shipping out features almost every single week. And this is normal. Sometimes when you go into an enterprise and you're trying to scale a business with design thinking, they usually have processes in place. It's something that's already there, and you kind of have to embed yourself into it. So we had to understand the landscape of what we were working with. Like, how are you running your business currently? And how do we lay new foundations with design thinking? So we walked into the office, and as the sole designer in the office, I basically spoke to the team about a new upcoming service that was working in their product, or what were they doing next? How can we apply design thinking into their next increment? So they were saying that they were set to go live in the UK across multiple different locations with one of their services. Now, they originally sent me a bunch of requirements, and they basically said, we need you to define the UX for the dev team. Remember, this is an organization that is primarily focused on engineering or led by engineering. So we need you to define the user experience or the UX for the dev team. Can you think about it? And we'll check in by the end of the week. Okay, so what does that mean? How do we apply design thinking to a challenge like this? So remember, the design thinking process is about being able to frame the problems that currently exist and be able to empathize with those end users and be able to come up with new ideas of how to solve for their pain points. So rolling into the week, we looked at the existing platform and we essentially tried to frame the problem, right? Frame how the infrastructure of the product is working, right? So we worked with the product lead at the time to get some fast-paced ideation while validating any gaps in the requirements that we saw. So we were framing the idea from the infrastructure of the product. We were then trying to empathize with our end users, trying to understand what their behaviors were like and what their motivations were for this service. And we did that through many different, there was previous workshops and feedback data that we were leveraging. So we were better to empathize and frame it against the problem that we're looking for. And then we were able to just come up with different ideation phases and be able to just come out with different ways and opportunities to solve for. So once we took that design thinking process and we were able to apply that to even a small set of features to this service, and we presented this back to the business in terms of a demo, and their first question was, where are the screens? So it's really interesting because we learned from the business directly that they were not applying a design thinking methodology from the very beginning. Their idea was that to define the UX to enable the development team, and that means screens, that means deliverables, that means UI and things like that. Whereas from a design thinking perspective, you're trying to understand where the business is coming from, how they've got to where they've got to, trying to empathize with your end users, and then be able to solve for those initial problems. So to understand the design thinking aspect of it all, we needed to understand the business logic. So obviously, why is this product to even exist? What is it trying to do? And how is it trying to enable customers? We also have to look at it from a technical perspective. There's probably a lot of integrations taking place within a product. And we probably need to understand how that impacts certain users whenever we're working with them. And then obviously take into account the end user behavior. What motivates them? How do we do things? And how do we enable their workflow a little bit faster? So the response that we gave to the business was that we can't make screens unless we understand the nature of the problems that we're solving for. And that's essentially what this whole process was about. The first couple of weeks while working with this business, who asked for pure deliverables from the very beginning, had just been witness to the initial design thinking process or the problem solving process of how we solve problems with design thinking. And the response that we got was, that's great work, but I could have told you all of that in a meeting. So you didn't have to do the level of theater that's on the board, and you didn't have to, try to reframe the problem or understand the users or empathize with the end users. I could have told you all of that, which is fair. I understand that. Obviously we're working with a subject matter expert, and they clearly know what they're talking about. But a lot of people, when we heard that statement, the first thing that a lot of people were looking at was, I could have told you all of that in a meeting, which tells you a lot about the culture that was set for them, and that design thinking was not even implemented into their business. But the one thing that I like to focus on is the fact that they called it great work. So that means that the design thinking approach resonated with them. It was clear to them that they had seen or had witnessed a real problem-solving approach. And we were able to capitalize on that. It was our opportunity to capitalize on that and extend the problem-solving process. So We framed our ideas, we empathized with our end users, and they considered it great work. So it wasn't wasted in any way. If anything, they were surprised, and they were surprised by the fact that somebody was taking their business very seriously. So we brought them in. We were like, okay, that's great. You appreciate our work. Let's bring you in. Let's use your expertise. Let's learn from you. So we started to develop more ideation-based sessions, started to bring the business into it and carry them with us on this problem-solving journey, this design thinking journey. And then, through this ideation, we were able to come up with new ideas. We ended up learning a bit about the supply chain and trucking industry that we didn't know about. We started to know what end users' motivations were, and on even some of the industry standards that were somewhat arbitrary within the industry, but not necessarily understood within external consultants. So once we got all these ideations and they got really excited, they were very happy about it. They were like, oh, I absolutely love this. This is great. We're coming up with great ideas. We're trying new things. So then the question that I asked is that, once we came up with all these different ideas and we framed them and ideated with them, I then asked the question, how do we know that this will resonate with our end users? What do we do? So let's not forget that they appreciated our great work. The seed had ultimately been planted in their minds that design thinking can actually help them. So they had been given their first taste of design thinking without them even knowing it. And to even better empathize with the end users, we included the business as part of these sessions to be able to come up with new ideas and give us new expertise, not only on the product level, but also on the engineering level. So the capabilities of what the front end and the back end was able to utilize. So with all that said, as a result, to validate this with all the users, we built a case to essentially validate our ideas with our customers, right? Because we still needed to produce things into the last increments of design thinking problem solving by validating this with end users. So through the test, we produced user testing and contextual inquiry. So contextual inquiry is when you're somewhat overshadowing someone and just learning about their day-to-day. And the purpose of doing this was to essentially go out to the ports, sit with these people, with the end users, understand where they're coming from, and validate the findings that we had. So all those ideation sessions that we came up with, we packaged that up into a prototype and put that in front of end users. We got in front of their environment at the ports directly, being able to see how containers were moving between trucks, how the truck operators were organized, how transport operators were organized, and actually just learn what they're all about. What are their lives like? What are their days like? How do we understand what their motivations are day by day? It turns out that there's a lot of people who do this day in, day out, and it's almost like a lottery and Monopoly. We would never have known that from a set of requirements in an Excel spreadsheet. So through all of this, by getting in front of our end users, understanding what their lives are like, working with the port community, we were able to focus on two aspects: to be able to automate our approach or our solutions for power users, and also create a simple experience for new users. We actually met someone from the community who had just started the job 2 weeks ago. And we were talking about the product and our ideas from a very legacy perspective. So we weren't actually catering for anybody who's starting the job for the first time. Now, as a result of all of this and finding all of these outputs and validating the ideas that the business thought that we could actually utilize, we ended up de-scoping, a couple of requirements, or a massive set of requirements in the initial phase. And we validated a lot of the ideas that we focused on with almost 20 different users in multiple locations, multiple journeys, multiple ideas, and learning what their responses were to these things. So this is ultimately the power of how design thinking can ultimately affect the delivery cycle. It's the fact of not just making a lot of assumptions and being able to run on your subject matter expert knowledge, but also just being able to frame the key problems and solve for them wherever they may be. So in summary, what we're trying to do from the delivery aspect is to build empathy by getting in front of end users, by getting in front of people, understanding what they do on a day-to-day, frame the problems better. So to be able to say, it's key that this is a requirement, but this is what users are actually doing. And this is where we need to solve for this more so in a key area as opposed to satisfy the entire requirement. We can also build a hypothesis for new solutions, not necessarily in the first increment, but in the next one. And we build a stronger connection with our end users. That's probably the most important thing, is that when you're designing or using design thinking to produce products that are connecting with your end users, you have more reason for people to come back to you, feel more comfortable working with you, and also just provide you more insight that any other testing environment could ever give you. So having that strong connection is really, really important. So bear in mind that we walked into the business and they were very delivery focused, right? And through that mindset, they were able to get their first taste of design thinking, and they saw the potential of how it could scale their product. And even to this day, I'll be very honest with you guys, not really sure what really sparked their influence of design thinking. They probably heard the buzzword somewhere and was like, oh, that's a nice thing. But when you witness it, still not sure to this day what the connection was for them. Maybe that there was a light bulb moment that went off while we were doing the testing and they were like, oh, actually, I've never seen this before. I've never heard our end users do this before. Maybe it was the light bulb moment of the fact that they were the first supply chain business to ever do this within the entire industry. Or maybe it was just a pure theater of the war room. Whenever we see our unicorns that we read about on TechCrunch or we learn about in our boot camps, we're always referring to these unicorns that produce amazing war rooms with Post-its everywhere. And, we're really innovative. So, not necessarily saying that they understood the value, but then they also appreciate the theater that goes along with it, or maybe it was just a way of the fact that they ask questions or we ask questions to them about something that they may have thought is fairly arbitrary. So one day, while we were actually doing the testing with the users in the UK, we were sitting around having breakfast, and essentially we had the final round of user testing come to us, and the business asked me this simple question. So we've applied design thinking to one service so far. How do we do this for all the other services and get a similar outcome? So this is really interesting because now the business was wondering, okay, we have one service and applied design thinking, but we also have other services. So how do we make sure that we're operating on the same model and the same concept and getting the same outcomes? So they were already used to the idea of being able to empathize with users for one service. But how do we get them to empathize with users on a whole wide product service? So we have to look at design thinking and what it encompasses. When we heard that statement, it was like, okay, we've done it for one service, but how do we make sure that we can make it consistent across the whole business? So design thinking essentially satisfies three key areas. Number one, the end users, right? So being able to understand the desirability aspect. Making sure that we're satisfying business objectives, so making sure that we're going to market in the right direction and we're reaching the same goals. But are we utilizing technology to the best way possible, right? Now, when you focus on these three key areas in design thinking, you essentially create a trifecta of innovation, right? Which essentially allows you to prioritize your assumptions as a business and focus on the growth in the right areas. So for example, if we want to implement design thinking in a uniform state, we have to think about our business objectives and our end users. We may have a lot of data there, but we need to focus on how we apply that on the technology front too. So to better understand the business growth and the upcoming project roadmap, we basically had to build a strategy to solve the critical problems of each service that they had. So bear in mind that we satisfied one service. We had multiple services across the whole product, and we had to apply design thinking to all of them. So our work initially brought the minds of end users. So we used business. So we brought product and design together to empathize with those end users. These are the advocates for the end users. And then we've also got the business aspect, being able to justify that with their objectives and how they want to release to the market. However, for the remaining services and for all the other areas of the product, there is one key area that we were missing, and we needed to leverage the engineering teams more than importantly, because they were essentially the focal point of the organization. The engineering teams are the ones who had built this product from nothing. They are the ones who are ultimately bringing the product into the new era. So although we can carry on our design thinking approach to scale the business from a design perspective and from a business perspective, we have to enable one of the key focal points of this organization, which is the technology aspect. So what we did, we then broke it down into each service. We then broke it down into different workshops. And these workshops essentially allowed us to look at each service independently and align on the goals of each service. So one service that we tackled initially with the user testing and with the initial design thinking was on trucking. We also had to think about container management. We had to think about the other supply chain methods. We had to think about customs declarations and things like that. So what are the motivations and what are the goals of each of those services? And let's look at their end users. Are they sitting in the port? Are they sitting in trucks? Are they sitting in back office? You know, what are they doing? How are they thinking? How are they feeling? And let's look at the current state of how they're working at the moment. So in each service, let's use the business information in terms of how it works in the port community aspect, but also from a technology perspective in saying, how does all of these services connect with each other? Then, once we've been able to do all of that, we can then identify the pain points of each area, of each service on a holistic level, and then be able to solve for them with different ideas and ideation. So what did we do? We essentially enabled all areas of the business and we brought them all into one big room. And we said, we're going to focus on these 4 key areas for each service over the next couple of days. So we brought representatives of product, design, and engineering and business and ran them through these workshops to better understand the business aspect of everything, understand why we are doing what we're doing, and also understand the nature of the engineering aspect. So here we're trying to understand and empathize with our end users of each of these services. We're also trying to understand from a technology perspective, how do these services communicate with each other? How do they connect the dots? And how does it impact their end user experience? And then we use these platforms to basically collaborate with each other and learn from each other about the complications of this entire product and each service. So rather than having teams working in silos, we're all using design thinking methods to be able to learn from each other so that we can make better decisions. So the engineering lead, for example, would know how to structure themselves in such a way that would enable the business logic. And that would allow us as designers to be able to communicate and build and design for the right users and create the best experience given the constraints that they're working. How did that all go from an organization who had never seen design thinking before? They absolutely loved it, to be honest with you. I think it was the first time that they were able to see a consensus and the pain points of each individual team. So the business team didn't actually understand why engineering wasn't able to perform certain tasks or create certain features or leverage certain other APIs to communicate with each other. They didn't understand why design felt so constrained by engineering. So getting everybody in the same room and trying to understand the context of where everyone's coming from, designers and engineers and product could then better collaborate on the structure of the entire product and be able to understand how they approach net new applications or net new services, rather than blindly designing interfaces and saying why they don't work. So the whole purpose of this design thinking engagement is to enable each team member. At the beginning, we had focused on enabling product, design, and business, but now we needed to bring engineering and technology into the picture to get a full holistic picture. So the workshops that we did essentially allowed us to create a clear direction with all of the teams and stakeholders about how we apply our domains into the next increments. It almost set a cadence for adjusting net new increments in the roadmap. So if we wanted to do something that would affect if we wanted to do something in a service that would affect the roadmap later on, we would have to run through this workflow or process to understand why we're suggesting a change. So we would have to validate things with engineering. We would have to validate things with product. We have to make sure that it's in line with the business objectives and it's still, turning around an income, etc. But most importantly, these workshops essentially enable the cross collaboration between the designers and the engineers, because this essentially allowed design and engineering to be able to work together in order to create the increments as fast as possible. So design wasn't coming up with an idea that engineering didn't know how to handle, and engineering wasn't necessarily giving orders and restrictions to why it can't be designed a certain way. So when we think about design thinking, we go back to that idea of framing ideas, empathizing, and trying to come up with different ideas and experiment. How we do that in a discovery aspect is that we have to understand that we need to build empathy from a desirability perspective. We need to build a business case from the business perspective, just to make sure that what we're doing for each service is viable. And we also need to consider building the art of possible. So understanding from technology what's available and how do we maneuver. And there's lots of different questions that you ask when you're trying to build empathy, for example, like what is the value proposition? Does this make sense for our end users? And are they really asking for this service, or is this a positional play for the business to stay competitive? Is this really what users are asking for? When building a business case, can we build a sustainable product? What are the costs? How is this true for the work that we're currently doing? And even when building the art of possible, does this actually work? Whatever design, product, and business is suggesting, is this even functionally possible for the future? Is this the direction that the technical architecture is being structured in such a way to enable us for the future? So in all overall perspective, we were able to understand the design thinking approach on the delivery and discovery process. So we entered on day one. We introduced them into design thinking. We gave them a taste of how to frame problems and solve for them. We were able to position them in such a way to enable more collaboration with the business. We were able to get in front of end users, and we were able to really learn about their motivations. And we were able to collaborate with each other and learn from each other about how to be better designers, better engineers, and better product managers. And then we all rode off into the sunset, and it was a great day. And here I am today telling you this story. That last part isn't true, more than anything else. But what I will say is that the business came back to us at the end of the conversation and said, I've really seen the value that we've brought to design thinking. Can we do this all the time? Yes, indeed, we did rode off in trucks, not necessarily horses. So at the end of the workshops, they essentially asked us, like, yo, I've seen the value, I've seen the collaboration, I've learned a lot from my engineering teams and my product teams. How do we do this all the time? And let's bear in mind that this business had essentially got their taste into design delivery and discovery, right? And we wanted it to be just more than just a case study. We didn't want it to be just another nice press release that we say that this organization is benchmarked against the biggest tech companies in the world. There's an old saying whereby people talk about what they've done, and then there are others who actually act on what they do. And for this organization and this business, they were on the brink of success. They were essentially being benchmarked against these unicorns that we talk about, and actually were working across it and learning from it every single day. There was an opportunity to apply design thinking in their roadmap, which is what we've already done, but in parallel also empower their engineering and deliver and build faster. And that's where we decided to embed design thinking into how they grew their teams, right? So the team that we were trying to build and grow is more leading towards enabling the engineering team. These guys is still an engineering-led business, and we weren't there to, the problem wasn't about there are too many engineers or we're not thinking like designers. Like, no, we had to frame the problem in such a way that it would enable our engineering team. Let's go back to the design thinking principle. We were able to satisfy the end user perspective, and we've shown case study and value in doing that. And throughout this entire process, we've always been enabling their business objectives, and we've been very transparent about those things. But what about the technology? What about the engineering teams? How do we leverage that? So in order to grow a team, and in order to embed a design thinking process into their teams, we had to look at their existing team structure. Each service in the product, so the product was broken up into many different services, and each service essentially had a team of multiple people. But the general consensus is that each service had product, front end, back end, and QA representatives, right? This is essentially how the teams were structured, and this is what we as we're trying to embed design thinking into. I'll be able to answer any questions that do come through in the chat. So if you do have them, do pop them in there, but I will address all of the questions at the end. And then we've got about 15 minutes to get into those questions. With regards to the services in the product, the teams are broken up by product managers, engineers, and QA. And we needed to apply design thinking into each of them. So the key is to make, so as of now, we had applied design thinking and designers into one service, but now we needed to apply them to each service. Now for each service, we essentially had to have a design team for each of them, right? So to be able to, in order to enable the process of design thinking, so to run the discovery workshops or to implement user testing or to ideate with end users, with the business and things like that, we needed to build a team of robust individuals to be able to handle the end-to-end design thinking process. It was fairly easy to manage with one person at the start, but if we're trying to carry this over across each service, we need representatives in different areas. So we need designers to be able to frame problems. We need designers to be able to run ideation sessions, and we also need designers to help satisfy the engineering teams and also validate with end users. So this team can get quite robust, but essentially what we try to do is to focus on having, rather than have a representative everywhere we go, or for each specific area, we focused on one person per service. And this person was known as the design anchor, right? Now, this actually carried over into their engineering teams and their product teams as well. So we essentially produced this anchor representative to be the advocate for all design thinking principles across each service. So the design anchor would essentially connect with all the other anchors within their service and others to be able to learn about the current increments that are needed, that needed design delivery support. So these are the things that are currently in sprint. Upcoming increments that were provided more end user feedback. So things that were coming in the next couple of weeks or so. So did we have time to put that out in front of end users and be able to learn from them? And future state increments that needed a little bit more discovery. So this anchor person per service was there as a representative to be able to understand where design thinking can be applied to discovery and delivery with respect to their service. Let's bear in mind at the very beginning, we applied it to the trucking element. We also wanted to apply it to the customs declaration output, the billing aspect, the container management aspect. So all of these areas required their own level of discovery and their own level of cadence when it came to delivery. So this design anchor within each service would be able to enable those areas. So when we looked at the design team initially, as I mentioned before, we had one lead and two UX UI people essentially running the design thinking process for one specific service. As we learn about new services, we needed to apply more leads. So we needed to apply someone to essentially advocate for that specific service. And then in order to support the outcomes with regards to the design thinking principles, so whenever we came up with new ideas and it needed to be supported for engineering, we had to take on more people. So do you see how the team was essentially growing? The design team was massively growing as a result, just by trying to embed design thinking into each service. So we had one designer per one service. That then grew to 3 people for that one service. And then eventually, as a result of all 5 services, we ended up having 15 people, you know. And this is all with respect to applying the design thinking principles to those key services. Now, while that's all very well and good, remember what I said at the beginning, which is all about enabling the engineering teams, because as much as I said that there were 15 designers in the organization, there was probably another 50 engineering teams in-house. So the business is still focused on its engineering-led principles. So in order to enable them, we had to make sure that we ensured a high velocity on the delivery and be able to keep rework to a minimum. So any ideas that we came up with as a design team, essentially, we didn't want to cause a roadblock for our engineering team. If anything, we wanted to try to enable them to deliver faster and to be able to turn around things without necessarily any rework. So as a result, to satisfy that and to better enable our design deliverables or our product deliverables, we produced an in-house design system for the entire product, right? And the whole purpose of this was to almost enable not only the product teams and the engineering teams, but also the business to make faster decisions. The fact that we had many design anchors across each service, we couldn't have designers saying different things and coming from different perspectives. If there was a central source of truth that defined some layer or a direction of the design or the product, that needed to be benchmarked first before any new increments were to take place. So this also enabled our engineering practices to think about new ways of collaborating with design and also improve and elevate their code quality and test coverage. So when building out that design system and growing those teams, again, we're still using the design thinking methodology here, or the framework. The idea of that we're framing the problem that we're trying to solve in terms of trying to embed design thinking principles into each service, empathizing with our end users, who would be product and engineering teams in this case, and enabling a consistent user experience across any increment that was being developed, right? And then as I mentioned, the design anchors across each service, or any anchor for that matter in the service, would be leveraging the design system as a baseline to anticipate any effort for any future work. So if an engineering anchor would always be leveraging the design system to give a baseline amount of effort that is required to build something. So if we learn from our end users that we want to build a new feature, an engineer could come back to us and say, right, just to set this up as a baseline using the design system could take X amount of time or X amount of effort. Similarly, a designer could come forward and say, right, in order to produce a end-to-end design flow and prototype of a new feature using this design system, it will be a baseline of 5 days. So it was always acting as a central source of truth and a language that we can communicate with. So let's not forget, for this business in question, design thinking yielded the results in terms of being able to give them new ways of working for their new products, right? Especially the trucking product. However, and that was on the delivery aspect, and even being able to on the external perspective. On top of that, we were able to enable them internally, making sure that their operations were enabled by these principles on a day-to-day basis. So was engineering always framing problems? Were they always trying to ideate and come up with new solutions? Were they validating this with the end users and getting design to support it? So building a whole fully optimized advocated design thinking team continuously frames and the ideation of increments, consistently empathizing with end users and validating it with them. And it produces high performing teams across each service because you've got an advocate for each key area of design thinking. And what you're trying to do is to make sure that you're focusing on what's most important for the user while being cognizant of your development constraints as well as the motivations of the business. So that's just one business, and that's an active example of how we use design thinking within scaling certain enterprises. But what about all of the other ones? What about, you know, where do we even get our inspiration from? Which enterprises are essentially scaling their business with design thinking? So one thing I will say is that design thinking still continues to be a buzzword, right? It's probably the most branded and publicized frameworks out there in terms of how to come up with new ideas or solve problems. So in terms of design thinking, we've helped these businesses uplift their operations, not only from an engineering perspective or from a product, but also from a product perspective as well, by using design thinking and embedding that into their teams, whether that be through the delivery aspect or whether that be through discovering new markets to enter. Having said that, there are also a lot of different companies who apply this very differently and come up with their own frameworks to essentially how they run their businesses. Ford, for example, is a great example because they recognize the value of design thinking to the point where they've introduced D Ford, which is essentially Ford's design arm to drive innovation and create new products utilizing design thinking. IBM is a perfect example by producing their own internal coursework to essentially apply design thinking in all solutions that they produce. Facebook is no different. Facebook or Meta platforms, as an example, is essentially has invested in a massive giant testing framework. You know, so they're always validating and running different versions of Facebook every single day, just to learn and frame new problems every single time. Even from IBM's perspective, Phil Gilbert, who's a general manager, has talked about how design thinking essentially leads other people to get to the right answer and enables them and get them to adopt it, so that you can continue solving increments of problems as you go forward and learning more about your customer. And again, building that stronger connection with your end users, which is really important. So we've talked about design thinking on a technology perspective, but I do want to make it very clear that it's not technology orientated. Design thinking is also applied in almost any different industry. So Walmart, Nike, Starbucks, and PepsiCo, these guys relatively you wouldn't consider them technology companies. Having said that, they're more entering the fast consumer goods market, but they are applying these principles to run their businesses and to empower their employees and to be able to produce great products. So Nike uses it in their design aspect and their design thinking, but then also Walmart uses design thinking to better empower their operations on a day-to-day. So how their supply chain works with the groceries across the United States. They're using design thinking principles to understand and empathize with their own staff to be able to enable them better and develop internal systems, not necessarily technical systems, but any other system that will enable them and give them solutions to be able to work, which is why they are the size and they have the same value and that we talk about. You know, when we speak about them in high regard, you could say it is down to the design thinking principles they have internally, just by the way that they structure their problems and how they solve for them. So how does design thinking essentially impact your business? Pradeep, you asked a question interesting about the return on investment of design thinking. This is essentially what I'm going to get into a little bit. So when we apply design thinking, what impact does it have on a business when you choose to scale? What I will say is that design thinking doesn't stop becoming a buzzword, right? It's still going to be something that someone throws out on your coffee break, you know, or at the water cooler, or while you're walking away and being like, hey, I've heard about design thinking. Do you know what that is? Or we need to apply design thinking to our approach. You know, and everybody wants a piece of this. Do you know what I mean? Like everybody loves to say it, loves to talk about it, is empowered by it, and they want to try things, you know? Similarly, like the business I just shared with you earlier throughout this entire session, some people want to get involved, but they just don't know where to start, you know? So it's still a fairly ambiguous place to be, design thinking. It's still not necessarily considered mainstream, but there is massive impact that does come from it. So as I said, rather than looking about design thinking as a framework or a mindset or an approach or things like that, it systematically solves problems within your business. It's a way of systematically solving problems. So if you have a problem within your business and you want to apply design thinking, the best approach is to essentially just start, is to frame that problem and understand why that is a real problem and how does that affect your business? How does it affect your technology? And how does it affect your end users? And which one is the primary in this aspect, So, whether it's about, whether you're forecasting your product roadmap or you're trying to tackle an end user's product challenge or trying to uplift your engineering stack, you need to be able to frame the question that will better understand the problem that you're facing, and continuously learn through ideation and iteration. So it may not necessarily be applicable to just your business or to just your product. It may not be that an end user doesn't know how to use a feature, or you're getting drop off because of a certain journey. It could be that the problems that you have may even live within your CI/CD pipeline in your engineering team. So how do you understand the better problem to be able to rectify that and produce a solution that could enable your engineering teams across other squads? It doesn't necessarily need to apply to a design problem, a business problem, or a technology problem. It can apply to any one of them. So, like I said, it's really important just to bring the aspect of people together, all areas of your business. I think why design thinking doesn't necessarily work very well, primarily the biggest factor for that is because teams still operate in individual silos, right? The fact that you're not actually gathering insight from end users, you're not learning about what impact your work directly has. So bringing people into a room helps you frame problems better. It helps you collaborate and build stronger connections and build conversations and learn about things so you understand why you're doing what you're doing. It helps you generate new ideas. It helps you think about things from a different perspective, and it helps you learn more or become more of a subject matter expert so you can enable the next generation of engineers or designers or product managers. And it creates new habits, you know what I mean? So I think the idea of collaboration just challenges and pushes the boundaries of how teams should work or how they should run their sessions or how they should have their meetings. It just brings a whole new dynamic to your working environment. And that's essentially the level of impact that it can give you. It brings a fresher, more collaborative and a more positive, constructive environment to your work. It's not just about, I've told you this and this is a real problem and I need you to solve it. It's about asking, why is that a problem? Let me help you. Maybe I can give you a different perspective from design or from engineering. Maybe there's a reason to why we built our product the way they do. Look at the organization that I just spoke about. Maybe there's a reason to why their team and their structure and their outputs are the way they are, is surrounding by the fact that they've been led by engineering. That's not a bad thing. We need to leverage that and understand that and be able to still produce wins as a result. Just to give you some context and some more tangible return on investment, I think, especially for the organization that we worked with and the business that we worked with, they were operating in Scrum. They were operating with sprints every single week. And as we continue to develop more and more design thinking principles into their business, we took an average sprint burn down. So we took about 5 sprints and calculated their average sprint burn down prior to implementing our first method of design thinking, and then measured it slightly later on. And we ended up seeing a massive change, something more traditional of what you expect a sprint burn down to be. Here we were going back and forth, bringing new things into sprint, not necessarily clearing things up because of dev tickets not being as accurate or not having enough assets to better support ourselves from a development perspective, or design not being able to produce the right solution on time, to here where we enabled more collaboration, more accuracy, more knowledge, and it helped us create new ideas and solve problems faster. So what is the impact of design thinking? What does it do? Design thinking essentially enables not only just enterprises, but also startups or anybody who has an in-house product or is running teams. It essentially organically grows teams from the ground up with different guilds and anchors. You've got advocates for every single aspect of the design thinking process. You've got people who are always questioning. You've got people who are always creating. And you've also got people who are always validating. Ideation, so it enables you to ideate and develop concepts to allow faster time to market. So the more ideation you have, and the quicker you do your validation, the more accurate you are to satisfying your end customers and enabling your business, which essentially allows you to get to market faster with the right product that you feel makes sense. On an engineering perspective, design thinking can actually help you create more constructive dev tickets, which essentially improves their practices, allows more sprint points, more points to be covered within each sprint, and actually enables your test coverage as well when you're building. But most importantly, design thinking ultimately enables any business to produce and start a cross-functional collaboration with all teams in your business. So, the product team is talking to design, who's also talking to engineering, who's also influencing product that then affects the business and marketing. And it brings a whole cohesion of knowledge to one central focal point and enables each team member to go and produce greatness within their subject matter. So if a designer has an idea and they validated that and it matches the product roadmap, it then allows products to be able to forecast where the product is going and anticipate that with the business in terms of cost. And it also enables engineering to build and set themselves up for success in case any new increments come up. So that is the value ultimately of design thinking and why it's really important to scale a business with it, not just only on the discovery front, not just only on the delivery front, but also on any in-house business problem that you may be facing. So we've just gone for 1 hour. I just want to thank everybody who has joined today. Thank you very much for all of your ideas and feedback and giving me the opportunity to speak to you today.